Rewilding, depopulation, and energy. A trinity at the service of cannibal capitalism. By the counterintuitive. The national park has been converted into a gigantic private enclosure for the super-rich Javier Flores, Dr. Santa Cruz, Patagonia. Land is life, going back to anthropologist and author Patrick Wolf's definition of the matter as land is life, or at least land is necessary for life. Thus contests for land can be, indeed, often are contests for life. Wolf's expansive definition can be taken beyond its settler colonial history and framework, evolving further as a dialectic of our age, yet staying rooted to the question of land, corresponding nature and its acquisition by any means possible. Means that manifest as the environmental, scientific, economic, political, or purely exploitative, albeit bound within the planetary dominion of capitalism and those who orchestrate its power. Presenting 3 short stories across 3 continents, based in Argentina, Spain, and Kenya. Globally felt as a great and genuine interest at an economic, social, spiritual, and scientific level about the anthropogenic effects on the environment, as well as mitigating man-made ecological disasters. What goes unchecked, however, for most people, is the underlying logic of capitalism, which equates to a worship of industry, technological innovation, and productivism as ends in themselves. John Bellamy Foster. As a consequence, the global exploitation of nature that is based on capital's expropriation of the free gifts of nature is going up at an increasing rate. Yet such a ravenous and universal logic, be it American or Chinese or Swiss or Spanish or African or Argentinian or whatever, is always in search of new grounds, new acquisition, new prospects, new reforms, regardless of the fact that there is no new land available anymore on a fixed and long colonized planet. Since the limits to colonization were never defined, and whatever good achieved by decolonization, albeit recolonization, wields new mechanisms and new definitions, such as the emerging economy of rewilding, a type of world ecology mission that aspires to reduce human influence on ecosystems. The UN has listed rewilding as one of its top priorities and a range of methods needed to achieve the restoration of natural ecosystems, which they say must be accomplished by 2030. A giant anti-ecological scam to appropriate land, framed by the political and the scientific, empowered by private wealth, while ensuring the eviction of the invasive species and elements that include not just human beings but a range of animals, varieties of plants and trees as well. The idea and the term rewilding was literally robbed from the 1990s Earth First manifesto. Yet the idea and corresponding science did not insist on any privatization, nor expulsion of human and non-human entities. What is rewilding? Restoring natural processes, core emphasis on recovering geographically specific sets of ecological interactions and functions that would have maintained ecosystems prior to human influence. Rewilding, Wikipedia. How such prior to human influence will be achieved remains unresolved. Yet the process reveals ugly and bizarre contradictions right from the onset, as an entanglement between what and who are native to the land and those who wish to rewild it. A crusade that is fronted by scientists, ecologists, biologists, nature conservation specialists, dedicated institutions, backed by banks, big real estate corporations, and even the UN, currently engaged in the rewilding of Patagonia, Argentina, and Chile. The anti-ecological mechanisms of an economy and its corresponding culture that is dedicated to expulsion in the name of conservation, effectively depopulating Patagonia. Sebastian Salgado, independent journalist, Data Urgent. The principal architect of rewilding in Patagonia was Douglas Rainsford Tompkins, who passed away in 2015. In 1995, Tompkins, backed by several business interests as well as governing institutions, ecologists, nature lovers with deep pockets, and politicians, together launched the Rewilding of Patagonia, a movement that has rapidly transformed into a powerful NGO called Foundation Rewilding Argentina. Founder of American outdoor brand, North Face Inc., Tompkins was also a conservationist, outdoorsman, philanthropist, filmmaker, and agriculturalist. Since the early 1970s, Tompkins and his wife, Susie, had surveyed the region of Patagonia, mapping out the wilderness and biodiversity shared between Argentina, for the most part, and Chile for the rest, branding the region as a land in need of deep ecology, habitat restoration, and conservation biology. Tompkins and his buddy Hans Weiss, Swiss billionaire businessman, needed a guiding principle to justify their motivation. They did achieve it by isolating one endemic species, the maca tobiano, a duck that was apparently facing extinction due to invasive species and human influence. Nothing could be more clever and misleading at the same time. The seeds of urgent conservation, as well as a long-term plan to steadily depopulating the vast region, that Tompkins and Weiss began funding in Argentina and Chile during the early 1990s. And such a duck, the maca tobiano, could change public opinion as well as map out the mass acquisition of land and water bodies of the region. A project that eventually manifested as the Conservation Land Trust Argentina in 1993. It's important to note that Tompkins had struck a fortune earlier with Plain Jane, which later transformed into the world-famous retail outlet Esprit. In 1994, Tompkins married Christine McDivitt, chief executive of Patagonia, Inc., a U.S.-based outdoors fashion brand operating in 16 countries. Tompkins' marketing vision, the eco-capitalism of converting nature into cheap products and misleading euphemisms, converge in his documentary titled 180 Degrees South, Conquerors of the Useless. But the conquerors were neither benign nor did they come for the useless. Foundation Rewilding Argentina has managed to exclude roughly 280,000 hectares of Patagonia since early 2000, including the region of Cueva de Manos, with prehistoric value, caves with Neolithic handprints dating back to 15,000–13,000 BCE. The last 20 years, more than 130,000 Argentinians and Chileans have abandoned the region due to various social and economic pressures. For 4 generations, we have been here working on the land and the ecosystem without threatening any wildlife, and they come here to shame us about our lifestyle, our animals or livestock practices, the duck protectors, the rewilding experts, the biologists, the bankers, the New Age tourists. Elvira Kjanovic, Estancia El Correntoso. Tompkin and all the rewilding is but a symptom and not the root cause, one that was symbolized by the sellout of everything in Argentina and Chile during 1975 to 2000. World-famous figures like Milton Friedman, Ronald Reagan, Margaret Thatcher and Arthur Burns would isolate Argentina and Chile 1980s as their favored sites of neoliberal experimentation. David Harvey, Brief History of Neoliberalism. In Chile, everything can be privatized, including the spirit of earth, the mountains and the desert. Isabel Angelica Allende. The following period, 1990 to 2010, is a case study of hyperderegulation on both sides of the Cordillera, Andes, that included the privatization of forests, lakes, islands, highways, even water tables under the ground sold off to mining corporations and vast swaths of wilderness leased out to European and North American banks and institutions. The ravenous economic tendencies, framed in the global north, in countries like the US, Canada, Switzerland, UK, and Germany, achieved many things in Argentina and Chile. Yet specific to world ecology, key policies, and wildlife propaganda, managed to acquire a vast territory measuring almost 500,000 hectares and growing. Now renamed as the Nuevo Parque Nacional de Patagonia, stretching into the deep south end of the continent. Sofia Heinonen, CEO of the so-called non-profit conservation organization, Rewilding Argentina, also shows up in the 2023 top 100 female influencers of the world. The situation gets way worse with the new messianic right-wing president of Argentina, Javier Milei. While the leader of the nation has no particular concern for conservation of nature and nothing but denial of climate change, Javier Milei is very much concerned about the acquisition of land, freeing up nature and conversion of resources. No shock nor shame in declaring the Mapuche as terrorists. But some people fear that such a vulgar declaration is a precursor to an incoming genocide. Indie news channels based in Argentina reveal Milei's blueprint to depopulate Patagonia. Driving out the older generation, Argentinians as well as the indigenous Mapuche, while making space for incoming migrants, land developers, investors, hotels, and tourists, especially from Israel, Germany, Canada, and the US. Paramilitary forces that arrived recently were seen wearing the Argentine and Israeli national symbols on their uniforms. And that is really shocking. Diputada de la provincia de Río Negro, Magdalena Odarda. Milei's favored list includes rich Zionists fleeing Israel, IDF soldiers evading war crimes, Israeli tourists, reservists, and real estate developers. The die-hard rancheros, livestock owners, fisheries, farmers, shepherd communities, the Mapuche Alliance and Solidarity groups are left with no option but organize and resist, and a resident like Juan Enrique Nada, resident of Rio Negro, can see beyond the horizon when he says who knows at this rate of expropriation and buyout, in the future Argentina itself might cease to exist. Proyecto Patagonia documentary. Patagonia as a region, surrounded and infiltrated by various groups and their vested interests, is clearly up for destruction of many types. Perhaps naive to hope the people of that land may unite, as a last resort with a declaration of independence even. The question is about land and its corresponding relationship and age-old guarantee of life. They called it España Vacía, empty Spain. After nearly 3 decades of public pressure and endless parliamentary cycles, the government of Pedro Sánchez declared the central region of Spain, especially deep interiors, are facing a devastating crisis of depopulation. We must address this crisis immediately, March 2019. A country with approximately 47 million people, Spain is a very strange and sad story of abandonment and not just depopulation. The process began during the dictatorship of Franco, 1945 to 1975. Neoliberal economic rehabilitation of the 1980s and Spanish desperation to catch up with the rest of Western Europe. David Harvey, Brief History of Neoliberalism, would drive millions of young Spanish out of their native regions and the country itself. Depopulating Andalusia, Murcia, Castilla-La Mancha, Leon, Extremadura, Galicia and Aragon while towards the clusters of renewed economic growth and industrialization in Madrid, Catalonia, Bilbao, Santander, Pamplona and Valencia. No surprise to the average Spanish that more 3,500 villages have been identified as despoblada, depopulated, and the rate of depopulating villages has only risen since 2000s. The extremity of such a process and neglect can be felt over time. When a baby is born at last, after a gap of 40 years in the village of Los Giles near Almería in 2013, and yet again in Granxa, Oviedo, in 2022 after 45 years. The newborn's arrival in the most desolate places merits hope and celebration as much as proper media coverage. Any depopulated region is weaker in terms of the remaining population's resilience and their ability to protect their modes of production vis-a-vis modes of survival. 77% of Spanish municipalities have witnessed a drop in population. European Journal of Political Research 2022. And such abandonment provides an excellent opportunity for capital, business, and industries of scale to literally target and attack the interior's unattended lands, water bodies, and villages. Since 2010, following the market crash of 2008, as part of the recovery plans laid down by the EU Parliament, almost every Spanish political party has exploited the ecological and social weakness of such regions. Similar things have happened in Portugal, Italy, and Greece. But the champion of the race to wholesale expropriation of España Vacía is the energy industry. Of the many sun-kissed geographies and windswept regions of Spain that have been steadily recolonized by hundreds of big and small corporations, engaged in the generation and distribution of energy, setting up giant solar farms, windmill parks, hydropower facilities, data centers, logistical hubs, domestic photovoltaic systems, macro and microgrids, etc. Spain can boast about its renewable energy transition with promising figures. Wind energy production reached 22%, hydroelectric 10%, nuclear 4%, and solar 19% of total energy production in 2023. Wow, and well done. But numbers are not sufficient, even misleading to understand the larger energy scam going on inside Spain. On closer inspection, 3 principal aspects of generation and distribution highlight the involved scale of exploitation, ecological damage, and incoming risks. The geography of energy injustice, recently explained by Isaac Moreno Gallo. Regions that account for the highest energy consumption are Madrid, Catalonia, Pamplona, and Valencia. Yet clubbed together, they generate less than 15% of their energy requirement. It is Córdoba, Sevilla, Cádiz, Castilla-La Mancha, Murcia, Lugo, and Zaragoza that host an overwhelming majority of wind and solar farms, spread over thousands of hectares across natural wilderness and rural expanses. Yet the people of these regions do not receive the economic benefits, nor any energy discounts. The expropriation of land orchestrated by powerful energy cartels direct the governing decisions of every region within Spain. favoring the core centers of production, business, and tourism, and not the peripheral regions of extraction. Amazing peak of the scam, that every person living in Spain is paying more every passing year, more for fossil fuels as well as all the green-colored energy. Since 2020, energy prices have risen 0.2% euro/kilowatt-hour every quarter. Centralized energy distribution networks that involve millions of meters of cables, high-tension wires, and hundreds of substations also reveal an infrastructure of inequality and instability. The flow of energy between the big zones of generation and consumption take up a major part of the electricity grid, and it's structurally disproportionate. The urban population of Spain takes up a staggering 82% of the distribution network, while the remaining is routed back towards small towns, rural regions, and the deep interiors. The recent Iberian blackout, El Gran Apagón, best understood as a giant grid failure that plunged Spain, Portugal, and parts of southern France in a state of disarray in less than 45 minutes. The grid failure also exposed structural defects and a domino effect, El Pace, that no one was able to detect in time, even less manage the disaster from reaching its maximum impact. Millions of homes, shops, restaurants, offices, schools, banks, food storage units, even police stations, rural hospitals, train services, and traffic control systems were all knocked out because of one glitch in the system. Dozens of conspiracy theories that followed makes for a whole new story. Not addressed by mainstream media, not by Greenpeace, nor any interventions by Matico, Ministry of Ecological Transition and Environment, or by the autonomous governing councils, is the mass culling of birds due to ever more windmills. Birds of all types, be they up on a trophic level or small sparrows, bats, eagles, vultures, kestrels, kites, etc., all face unexpected death on a daily basis, unleashed by the giant blades of hundreds of thousands of windmills. Some of the birds are even enlisted as protected species, yet their real safeguard has been effectively decommissioned by energy corporations, engineers, leading ecologists within Spain, and the consumers alike. For now, Spain is firmly hooked to the myth of cheap energy and never mind the mass devaluation of nature. For there can never be any renewable energy on a non-renewable, fixed planet to even begin with. The utter stupidity of hawking our future to the capitalists who destroyed our past. Mordecai Ogata, wildlife expert and ecologist, Kenya. Thoroughly jaded by world ecology and its corresponding frameworks and laws of conservation, Mordecai criticizes the impact Western finance and capitalism, colluding with nature conservation in Kenya. The economies tied to tourism and wildlife conservation willy-nilly compound wealth inequality within Kenya, according to Mordecai. He points to a substantial growth in protected areas in the last 20 years, as being rooted in violence, exclusion, eviction, and disenfranchisement of hundreds of thousands of Kenyans. Mordecai's concern is not just about Kenya, while addressing similar wildlife funding and eviction of natives that is working its way in the interiors of Congo, Tanzania, Mozambique, and Madagascar. The underlying argument is so obvious that is able to bust a fundamental myth that wildlife needs to be protected from Black African locals who have lived in equilibrium with this wildlife since humanity began. Mordecai exposes the ecological hoodwink that has gone on for decades within various African nations, backed by African leaders and policymakers in favor of foreign interests and dominion. Western tourists, wildlife experts, ecologists, filmmakers, celebrities, etc. are encouraged to go on safaris all over Africa, even kill big game animals for sport. Yet there is no paramilitary outfits that will hunt and kill these foreigners, let alone burn down their villages and disallow them from accessing their sacred forests. As organizations such as WWF, World Wildlife Fund, have actually done alongside so many other multinational conservation organizations. Kenya finds itself at the crossroads of rapid economic growth, signing away swaths of jungles as carbon offsets and massive development projects spanning decades to come. Mordecai debunks the above trajectory as a long-term disaster, instead framing Kenya's current place in the global picture as part of the poor and the punished. True that wildlife conservation, as per Western maxims, destroys native food systems as well as privatize and militarize open habitats. There lies deep racist assumptions of the West that underpin conservation in Africa and perhaps elsewhere too. The no-brain Disneyfied myths also empower Western objectification of Africa, its nativity and wildlife. Severe contradictions arise within existing inequality because of tourism and capitalism, often exacerbating the urgency to protect wildlife. Kenya is a prime example of a decolonized society of namesake, and Mordecai is spot on when he says conservation today reinforces the institutions of colonialism, and how the language of crisis maintains these dubious institutions. Talk about death in the circle of life, as it relates to carnivores since the dawn of humanity. We have to include every contradiction of life that is part of nature. If you really want conservation, you have to allow natural processes to continue unobstructed. Wildlife and nature conservation that blocks indigenous interaction with the landscape is but a bunch of homogenized rules imposed on unfathomable complexity of systems. Nature itself would reject all such conservatory objectives and exclusionary missions. Argentina, Spain, or Kenya, or for that matter any nation, with whatever pristine nature to boast about or in dire need of conservation, globally speaking, conservation of nature is a vanishing prospect. Forest fires burned nearly 15 million hectares, the size of Greece, UNDRR, Canada, 2023. Thus brings us back to the ecological virtue, with all possible urgency that land is life, Patrick Wolf. Ever new abstractions, policies, promises, and projects that evolve from the fountains of planetary management and transition are most often subservient to capitalism, fronted by very many disingenuous, colorful, powerful institutions and influential individuals. In the form of world ecology, energy transition, overshoot, rewilding, wildlife conservation, Gaia worship, etc., is vital to remember that the trophic level of a ruling species and the position it occupies inside the web of life, Jason Moore, remains as is, the organism that must eat other organisms, as well as wage a continuous war on nature, may in turn eventually consume themselves via what is increasingly visible as cannibal capitalism. Nancy Fraser. Such shock-inducing terminology compels us to look around, investigate and understand the entanglements of capital with the biosphere crisis and the future of all remaining species. The wholesale expropriation of land, addiction to energy, neocolonization of remaining nature, and the mechanisms of depopulating land are all part of the planet's ongoing metabolic collapse. In case you wish to pledge support with a paid subscription, click here.